Zaibatsu, Megacorps. These are a staple in all cyberpunk fiction. But what if they became real life? See, many years ago, Japan was largely operated and run by Zaibatsu, which were large top-down organizations. They were companies. They run for a profit by families. And they controlled the major industry in Japan. To a certain extent, these Zaibatsu still exist in the form of keiretsu. And I'll be getting into more of that here shortly. But despite the laws that we have in the United States that are designed to prevent such large corporations from coalescing around creating the same type of monopolized power, we still have them here. And it's 100% legal. Now, you can argue whether that should be legal or shouldn't be legal. If you've got economies of scale, market efficiencies, there's all kinds of justification for allowing companies of this size to exist, and largely speaking, they're good justifications. But one of the things that we need to look at as we allow such things to happen is to consider what the long-term possibilities of such a company are and what dangers could be associated with it. See, in Japan many years ago, they had something called the Big Four. They were the four largest Zaibatsu in existence. They were Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Mitsui, and Yasuda. Mitsubishi, I'm sure you are all familiar with. It still exists today into the form of the Mitsubishi Keiretsu. The other companies have either renamed themselves or have otherwise not made a huge splash on the internet, under the international scale, under their original names. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not still owned by the same people. It just means that those keiretsu have subsidiaries that use other names. A good example is even Mitsubishi has this, where Mitsubishi's banking arm, Mitsubishi UFJ, has MUFG here in the United States, the owners of Union Bank outside of Vermont, New Hampshire. It's a different bank. In this way, they have managed to continue their legacy. They keep brand notoriety, or their brand continues to grow, and the people involved continue to thrive. We have a Big Four here in the United States, and that Big Four has a lot of power. Now, I want to lay out a little bit of groundwork right away. Nothing in this podcast is meant to imply that anyone is doing anything illegal. While I'm sure there's probably some individual bad actors in any company, no matter, once you reach a certain size, you're going to have bad actors. This is where some of the biggest lawsuits in the world have come up. I am not accusing these companies, systemically or individually, of doing anything illegal. I'm not directly accusing this company of doing anything wrong. However, we do need to review the largest, most powerful company possibly in the world and look at the power that it has and just keep in mind what it can do. Not that it is doing it, but that it can do it. And yes, to a certain extent, I am hedging my words. There are two reasons for this. One, I don't want to be accused of libel. I am not trying to accuse anyone of everything because I'm not trying to make false accusations. And two, because the company I will be not so much criticizing, but I will be looking a little bit deeper into, is the one that happens to own the platform you're probably watching this on now, YouTube. Now, this will also be pushed out to Rumble, of course, but YouTube is the largest, most prolific video sharing site in the world. And so, to make sure I stay on YouTube, I want Google's lawyers and YouTube's lawyers to boot to know that I am not accusing them of anything. Okay, we're navigating the cyberpunk dystopia. This is the Julien McBain Show. Hang on, guys. I'm having trouble. There we go. Okay. All my fans, of course, will know that I play Entropia Universe on the regular. And I did promise you all that I would not stop. So, okay. In order to really lay out what's going on here, I need to lay some groundwork. I kind of touched on it in the intro, but I really want to do a deeper dive into what the Zaibatsu were and why there is a direct allegory between the old Zaibatsu of Japan and the big four companies of today, namely Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Amazon. Now, I deliberately left Microsoft off of this list. It's not because they aren't super powerful or that they don't hold a large amount of control. Realistically, we have a big five, and Microsoft would be the fifth actor in that particular field. But Microsoft, for the most part, does not appear to be acting in any political fields. Bill Gates has his opinions, and he does what he says he wants to. But on the other hand, Microsoft itself has not been accused thus far of doing anything to affect political change. The other, at least the three companies heretofore named, Google, Twitter, and Facebook, have all been accused of influencing political processes, both in the United States and abroad. Now, again, I'm not saying this to accuse anyone of anything. Is it possible that they did? It's absolutely possible. They have the power. Did they? I have no evidence. Therefore, what I'm going to do is I'm going to review Google in the light of the idea behind a Zaibatsu and show just how much power this one company has managed to gather around itself just by growing the way it has. So, first off, let's dig into what a Zaibatsu really was. Zaibatsu were gigantic top-down corporations in Japan, what we would consider a corporation. They were all family-owned. That means that the Mitsubishi company was generally owned by the Mitsubishi family. So the name, when your name is on the building, you're likely one of the execs. And these families were huge. Traditional Japanese families operated a lot like European feudal families, and they, to a certain extent, some of the older families still do so to this day. As I'm sure any purveyor of Japanese anime would be able to attest in manga, there's still a lot of cultural aspects to the wealthier families in Japan. They uphold the tradition, even if they don't necessarily hold the power they used to back when they were a pseudo-nobility or even an actual nobility. The culture around these bigger families still exists to at least a certain extent. Well, back when you were able to, a lot of these families, they built up. They used the family as the core, and they built up these companies using the family name as the brand. And as you build a brand, much as I build a brand here, build a brand, not build a burg, your company continues to grow. And the way these Zaibatsu were organized were almost identical at their roots. Each of these Zaibatsu, from the big four to the smaller ones like Nissan and Kawasaki, haha, yes, those were Zaibatsu. Global for 252. Very nice. Thank you, Mindark. Lost my train of thought. Oh, these Zaibatsu were all constructed in roughly the same way. The first thing they would do is they'd find their niche, right? This is how they started. It would be a fishing concern or an industry concern or something of that matter. Oil, not oil, but raw materials, pig iron, things like that. And then they'd set up a banking arm. And the banking arm would really become the holding company for the whole Zaibatsu. The banking arm would finance all of their projects. They would hold all the accounts. This is literally how they managed to fund everything, is they formed their own banks. And even here in the United States today, this is not illegal. Not easy, because banking charters are not easy to form these days, but it's not illegal. So they formed the banking concern, and that would be the holding company. That was the center of the company, of the Zaibatsu. And then they'd have other concerns. They'd have their heavy industries, their light industries, their textiles and retail stores and food shops even sometimes. And they built up these gigantic companies built under this family. And the family, one family member would generally be the CEO of each arm, essentially. Well, then World War II happened. And Tojo, who was essentially a shogun, since Hirohito pretty much had no power during World War II, he had the purported power, but Tojo's just like, hey, we're doing this, and you can't really do much about it. Tojo nationalized a lot of Zaibatsu a lot of the Zaibatsu assets in order to fund and to power World War II. And the Japanese imperial machine was both financed and constructed by these old Zaibatsu, who were told what they had to manufacture, and they manufactured it for the empire. And it was very successful. And these families also suffered a lot of casualties because it was considered both an honor and an obligation to serve in the military. So a lot of their younger folk end up dying in battle. They have all the honor, but it doesn't leave the Zaibatsu with very many leaders. After World War II, you had the battle for Okinawa, which was just atrocious. You know, we won the battle, of course, but the death toll was out of control. And the 2 bombs dropped. The war ends. Japan surrenders and America walks in order to rebuild the country because there wasn't much left. We'd been bombing the islands, firebombed Tokyo numerous times. We just dropped 2 nuclear weapons, the most powerful weapon ever created, on 2 of their major industrial centers, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so we had to rebuild it. And the Zaibatsu, being the Zaibatsu, were like, well, we're here to help. We're going to reconstruct this country because that's the thing that we do. And the U.S. government looked at them and said, but you're monopolies. And the Japanese are like, what's a monopoly? We're not a monopoly. We're a Zaibatsu. So there was a clash of cultures in that. And in the U.S., we did have some monopolies. We still have monopolies to this day, and they're illegal. And I'm going to get into that a little later. But the U.S., especially in that time period, had a very anti-monopoly bent. So we pretty much forced Japan to break up their Zaibatsu. The only problem is now you've got all these concerns that all have the same name. So they took a very Japanese way of doing things. What they did is they formed Keiretsu. What is a Keiretsu? A Keiretsu is a Zaibatsu that does not have a central authority. So what they did is they formed separate corporate entities for these different concerns within the Zaibatsu and dissolved, theoretically, the Zaibatsu itself. And a lot of the major families were actually forcefully excluded from the Keiretsu with their names on it because they served the Imperial Japan in a certain way. I believe that's exactly what happened to... It was either the Yasuda or the Somitomo that their family was told, you are forbidden from having anything to do with your companies. And so they broke them up. They formed different entities. And then the various entities within the Keiretsu bought large shares of each other's companies. So now you've got an integrated network of autonomous companies all with the same name. Very Japanese solution in saying the family's not allowed to run everything anymore. So that solved the problem from the U.S. standpoint because companies in the U.S. buy each other all the time. You know, I could form a company and buy 10% of, I don't know, company A and company B and company C and company D, and it's a holding company. I'm just holding small amounts of it. And I might be able to own a large enough percentage to put myself on the board of each of these companies. And I might have half a dozen partners, and using the funds we get from all of those stock purchases, I might fund a company that builds something, and that would be a concern as well. And basically the same idea. Realistically, in the modern age, the U.S. has no problem with Zaibatsu. If we had the same mindset then that we did now, those Zaibatsu would still exist as Zaibatsu and not as Keiretsu. So let's talk about monopolies for a minute, because I'm sure for a lot of you, most of you will understand the premise of monopolies and monopsonies and what it really means in the way things operate. But for those of you who haven't really dug into monopolies, or whenever you think of monopolies, you only can think of the game, let's talk about monopolies, antitrust, and what it means in the U.S. The definition of a monopoly, this is the dictionary definition, and I believe, once again, I grabbed this off of, no, this one I think is from Wikipedia, is when a specific person or enterprise is the sole supplier of a good or service. And so, to be a true monopoly, you have to be the only supplier. And there are some of these that are 100% legal in the United States, and they're government authorized. The government signs off on it. The most notable of which are most of our utilities. So utilities are government-sanctioned monopolies that provide a particular service to an area. And an place where having competition might be difficult or logistically impossible. Electricity is a really good example of this. It would be highly difficult for electrical providers to provide competing electricity to the market along the same lines. You'd have to have separate lines. It could make the grid really confusing. Now, the U.S., who is morally opposed to nationalizing things, and this is something that I definitely support them not nationalizing things, because there is nothing in this world that operates things worse than a government. Instead of nationalizing it, they gave companies license to monopolize territories. And it's like, you're the only provider of electricity in this zone. And you're the only provider of electricity to provide electricity in this zone. And there's enough overlap to where if one company has an issue, other companies can step in. And they provide it because electricity works like water in a lot of ways, the way it flows. Not like it's wet or anything, but the way that you push electricity through it actually has a lot of properties that are very similar to fluids. They can help each other out. They get the benefit of the monopoly in their zone. They get the benefit of other companies that can help them out when they have an outage. It helps work for everybody. So there's also a secondary notion to that where you can be considered a monopoly if there's no meaningful competition in your area. So as an example, in my area, Walmart essentially has a monopoly. It has a monopoly for in the department store region because there's no meaningful competition to them in that space. We do have individual retailers that do compete with them in individual departments, but not on a wide scale. Essentially, they're a monopoly. Now, I'm not accusing them of doing anything illegal. They're not. If they were doing something illegal, the FTC would have brought suit against them. They're not practicing in any uncompetitive practices that would under the law. But it doesn't mean they don't essentially have a monopoly here. And it's not illegal. Certain behaviors that tend to come with being a monopoly are illegal, but the act of being a monopoly is not illegal. And in fact, a lot of monopolies are 100% sanctioned. As I said before, utilities are one, but here's another one. Copyright. Copyright is a form of monopoly. Patents are also a form of monopoly, and to a certain extent, trade secrets are as well. Now, trade secrets are not protected by the government per se, but there's a lot of laws against corporate espionage and sharing of trade secrets, to the point where when Pepsi had the opportunity to buy the Coke formula off of a disgruntled employee, this is an urban legend, the Pepsi guy called the Coke guy and said, hey, one of your former employees is trying to sell me your formula, and they did a bust. Again, that's an urban legend. I think it's true, but I don't know to what extent. But I'm getting off track. So, looking through my production here. Okay, meaningful competition. I've said before that monopolies can be considered monopolies because there's a lack of meaningful competition. You dovetail that with a lack of substitute goods. Substitute goods, of course, are something that could take the place of a good that you're looking for. So, like, I have a computer monitor. Computer monitors allow me to use my computer. If my monitor breaks, I need another monitor. I can substitute a television now to serve as my monitor with the right connections. That is a substitute good in that case. Now, obviously, a monitor and a television essentially do the same thing, and so that's not necessarily the best allegory, but it's close enough for this example. I can find a substitute that does the job, even if it might be a bit inferior. Monopolies, the downside to monopolies are a few things. One, oftentimes companies that hold a monopoly will act in uncompetitive ways, meaning they will stifle, stomp out, or prevent competition from breaking into a sector. This is why I said I wasn't accusing Walmart of anything, because there are other options out there, even though they're small pieces of the business that company has in my area. oftentimes these having a monopoly will lead to increased prices because there's no competition to force it down. This is where market forces come in. When you're the only supplier, you can charge whatever you want. Now, there is the supply and demand curve. At some point, if you raise the price too high on a non-staple good, or even on a staple good, because people will figure out a way to substitute, or they'll just go without, then if you set the price too high, there will not be enough demand to justify selling the product. See how that works? So the laws of natural competition actually help prevent monopolies from abusing the fact that they're monopolies. The heretofore mentioned department store is a good example of this when compared to other monopolies like power companies who can and have absolutely raised prices just because they can. Not just because they can, but they do have that control and that power. So, okay. As I said earlier, there are, I originally said 4, but really it's 5 Zaibatsu here in the US. The 5 big tech companies. Google, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, Microsoft hold the majority of market share in their sectors. Okay? By a long shot. To the point where meaningful competition for a lot of these companies isn't possible. Google owns the verb for searching. If you don't search something, you Google it. And I'm going to be going into Google more here, but let's look at other things. Facebook. The only competition there used to be to Facebook was MySpace, and they kind of disappeared. I mean, it still exists. You know, you remember the old days when Tom was out there, he wasn't trying to sell your info, he just did his thing and bounced. MySpace was the only real competition to Facebook, and Facebook completely clobbered them. Currently, there isn't a lot of competition in that space. You do have Minds, which is slightly different, but it operates on the same premise as Facebook. But it isn't used, it doesn't have the market share. Twitter, on the same notion, has the entire market of microblogging for all intents and purposes. Now, Parler has been growing at a huge rate, especially in light of Twitter's, a lot of Twitter's policies. They've done a lot to stifle free speech. But at the same time, it's going to take a lot of time before Parler even comes close. And like a lot of these smaller platforms, Parler is a bit of an echo chamber for the demographic that goes there. Amazon, of course, has the closest thing to meaningful competition Amazon has. There's a second global. The closest thing Amazon has to competition in the online retail space is from Walmart. And that's going to end up being a war. It really is. I'm very curious to see how that plays out. Jeff Bezos took this company he set up for selling books and turned it into a mega giant. So, Google. When you own the verb, that tells you have a lot of power in the market, people's minds. They're the largest search engine in the world, and they own YouTube, the second largest search engine in the world. Now, there's some benefits to Google that we all need to recognize. One, it has one of the most powerful algorithmic search functions in the world. It works very well. 2, it's free. But is that really the benefit? See, there's an old saying, when something is free, you're the product. See, Google collects gigabytes of data on every person that uses their services of any kind every day. They collect data on me every time I upload a video to YouTube. They collect data on me every time I have my phone nearby. I have my phone sitting, it's around here somewhere. It's on the table over there. It's got a microphone. I've got Google Assistant. It's constantly gathering information on me. When I do a Google search, it collects the information on what I'm searching. And what do they primarily use this for? Well, there's a couple of things they use this for. One, to serve ads. Google doesn't make money off of us doing searches per se. It makes money off of our data. And it uses that data in order to serve us ads that we are likely to click on. When we click on those ads, Google makes money. Usually a couple of cents. But when you dominate the space, when you completely monopolize the space essentially, and you're the only one that people search on, and the first things you put up are always ads. The first 3 links in any Google search, for the most part, are advertisements. You are the product because your click pays Google. And when you're used by billions of people worldwide, every click, even if it's only a penny, 3 billion people, 1 penny per click, and you're probably going to click an average of 5 to 7 links per day that give Google money. Doesn't take much to make millions every day, just on ad revenue. And that's just from Google searches. That's not Google's only company. Google is a gigantic conglomerate. There are Zaibatsu in every sense of the term. I can't guarantee that they have a banking arm. So maybe they're not a true Zaibatsu because they don't have a holding company that's technically a bank. I don't think Alphabet has a bank underneath it because Alphabet is the holding company that owns Google. But they do have every other marker. The other thing they don't have is they don't have a ruling family. The irony is that when Google was formed, they had a slogan, do no evil. Or don't be evil. That slogan, from what I understand, is no longer in use, which makes me give them a bit of side eye. But when you look at what they're capable of, okay, let's just take this from take a step back and just look at the Google search engine. The Google search engine works by trying to predict what you are going to search for. So when you start typing, it starts popping up recommendations. Those recommendations are based on other people searching for things. Ironically, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy because of the Pareto principle. That, of course, is the principle where the more something gets attention, the more attention it's going to receive because it builds up. That's how brands work. That's how YouTube channels work. So they continue to build this up. People keep looking at it either out of curiosity or because that's what they were actually looking for. And that's how trends are created. Twitter does the same thing. They'll look at a hashtag, and as hashtags build up, they'll create trends. Now, there have been accusations, and I believe some of them have come from internal engineers at a lot of these companies, including Google, Facebook, and Twitter. The algorithms do not work in a vacuum. They can be force-fed information. An engineer, or an engineer of some sort, whether they're a software engineer or a social engineer, can go in and determine that they want something to trend, and they can force the engine to make certain recommendations. Now, there have been plenty of accusations at all of these companies that this is being done. Is there evidence that this may have happened? Yes, there's evidence. Do I have that evidence? No. Am I accusing them of actually doing it? No. Because evidence isn't proof. You can search for something on Google and search for something on Bing and get totally separate recommendations. That's evidence that maybe there's a tweak on one side. Or it could just be that Bing, which gets far smaller market share in searches as opposed to Google, has a different user base than Google does. See, that's the difference between evidence and proof. Showing different results is evidence that someone might be tweaking something, but it's not proof that it is. All it is if someone's accusing them of doing something, they should dig in a little deeper. One of the people who are accusing Google of such things is Dr. Robert Epstein. He presented research to the Senate Judiciary Committee, I believe it was back in 2019, showing that Google's growing power could swing elections. I'm not saying they have swung elections. I'm saying they can swing elections. And this is something that has raised concerns not only in the US, but also in Europe. Because when you have the power to swing elections, there is the temptation to swing elections. This is something that we should be concerned with. Now, once again, I'm not saying that they've ever done it. I'm saying they are capable. The US has nuclear weapons. We've only used them twice. We have not used them since World War II. We are still capable of turning a nation into a sheet of glass. See the difference? And no, I am not advocating the use of nuclear weapons at all. I think the fact that we have the capability is horrific. But I understand the reason that we still hold on to them in light of other actors, other entities also having them. The best defense against such things is having the same capability. It's an unfortunate truth. And I can see all my libertarian friends screaming, not friends, all my libertarian friends and viewers screaming that I'm not a real libertarian for saying that, but shut it, okay? The non-aggression principle states that we don't aggress first. It doesn't mean we don't have the capability to aggress in kind. Again, I do not in any way, shape, or form endorse the proliferation or use of nuclear weapons. I need to throw that out there in its entirety. You know, I play a lot of Fallout. I may make jokes about things like my little meme where I put a picture of the Davy Crockett, which is the smallest nuclear weapon the U.S. ever produced. And it says, no, seriously, get off my lawn. That's a joke. I don't actually want that type of capability to be... I don't want people to think that that should be a common use item. So, I'm sorry, I got off on a tangent there because I was trying to delineate between capability versus actually doing something. Robert Epstein has done several exposés on various shows and podcasts about what Google is capable of doing, what Facebook is capable of doing. Now, he contends that they've done it from time to time, tweaking an election in one direction or another to suit people who may enact favorable legislation on their behalf. And considering the way that the machine in Washington works and the fact that unfortunately, corruption is an endemic part of our governing system, I can believe it. I'm not saying they have done it, but it would not surprise me. Yeah, I see you YouTube lawyers. No. Not accusing YouTube of anything either. Now, currently the people who are complaining about this is the right, of course. We just had an election. I'm not going to get too deep into it. Reality TV is our news today, and that's why I'm kind of avoiding that whole subject. Needless to say, what the right is bitching about today might be what the left is bitching about tomorrow, because that's happened before too. Okay? Freedom of speech is a good example of that. 20 years ago, the left was bitching about how the right was curtailing freedom of speech, and today the right's bitching about how the left is doing it. It doesn't matter. What one side is bitching about today, the other side will bitch about tomorrow. This is one of those things. And this is why we need to pay attention. It doesn't matter what political side you're on. This is totally nonpartisan. Even if we think it's a good thing that Google has this power, and maybe it is a good thing, there's all kinds of benefits we reap because of the power and the size and the scale that Google has. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be cautious as we navigate this wonderful dystopia that we've created around ourselves. And keep in mind what's going on. We want to know for sure what all of the people that provide us our goods and services are capable of and what we're actually paying to have those services. And what we as users pay in order to have those services theoretically for free, we pay them in data. Loads and loads of data. They know everything about us. Facebook has a shadow profile on you that knows more about you probably than you know about yourself. Google too. And this is from their engineers. They have stated this. Because it allows them to serve you ads. That's not nefarious. That's just capitalism. But that doesn't mean that something nefarious couldn't be done with that information. let's take this to to dead world status, where corporations are 100% or essentially benign, which for the most part I think they are essentially benign. So Google is a farm. What they farm is data. But then a foreign actor gets involved. An adversarial actor, whether it's foreign or domestic. It could be the Umbrella Corp from Resident Evil, or a foreign government. It doesn't matter. And they hack into these companies and steal that data. And now these companies, this entity has a huge trove of data on you and on me. This is why it's concerning. This is why it's concerning. We freak out every time that Experian gets hacked, which has happened more than once. I think it was Equifax, excuse me. When Equifax got hacked, everyone freaked out. But you don't realize the amount of data you give every company you operate with. And now with the hell was the name of the company? That major hack that happened this past Monday that I watched on one podcast on Monday. I didn't hear it from anyone else until Friday. Like, I did my podcast that released on Wednesday about the hack. I made that one on Monday. Yeah, Friday is when I heard about it in other places. That's how delayed it was. So, what we've created are these giant companies that have undescribable power in our culture. And what that's created is an aristocracy. They're technocrats. They use technology in order to rule. Now again, and I gotta stress, I am not accusing anyone of anything nefarious. But the challenge is, what do we do about it? What can we do about it? Now, of course, you've got people in government who always threaten antitrust to break up Google, break up Facebook. In fact, Facebook's currently facing a lawsuit that might break them up over anti-competitive practices that they've had. And I'm going to try to get a little research into that and see if I can't make an episode about what Facebook is facing right now, no pun intended. But what's the right thing to do? Because there are plenty of things we can do. But taking action for action's sake is not a good thing. We have to take the correct action. Currently, I don't think there is a correct action to take. We have no justification for breaking up Google for any reason. They've done nothing illegal to our knowledge. Or at least nothing so large as to justify and warrant the destruction of the company, essentially the destruction of the company, and the other things that could happen to, say, their employees if we were to go just arbitrarily walk in and break them up. It doesn't make sense. So, and then the other option that we could do is we could nationalize them, but I fall back on the anytime you involve government in anything, it becomes hyper inefficient and usually falls apart. I mean, just look at our roads. That wouldn't really work either because, technically speaking, one, the Constitution essentially forbids nationalization of industry. It's not in black and white there, but if you read it the way it's written, it is in Amendment 4, which makes warrantless search and seizure illegal. Nationalization is seizure of assets, which is illegal under the Fourth Amendment. So it's constitutionally, it's against the Constitution. It's unconstitutional to nationalize something of this nature. However, we still have the issue where we've got a private organization. Okay, no, I can't even say that because private organizations already run the country. That's what political parties are. They're private organizations. And currently we have 2 that run the country. But it does mean we have a technocratic elite. A technocratic aristocracy that decides what we can and can't look at, or has the ability to decide what we can and can't look at. I would, if I had to make an accusation, I 100% believe social media tailors what we see because they tell you they do it. I can go into my settings on Facebook and I look at the settings for me, and it even can tell me what my political leanings are. For the most part, it says centrist because I'm a libertarian, and for some reason companies don't understand how to deal with libertarians. They just assume there's a line and it's Republican on one side and Democrat on the other, and in between you've got people who are kind of undecided. That's not how it works. First off, there are 6 political tribes in America, and libertarians are the third political party that have that aren't like a single, I can't say that there are smaller parties, but they're the third major party. They've actually got a percentage of most votes where they're more than just single issue. And I'm not here to stump for the Libertarian Party. It has its issues as well, trust me. But these are all private organizations. But we do have this technocratic elite, as I tangent again. And the technocratic elite is something that we do need to contend with. And I'm not saying it's something that we can fight. I'm not even sure we should fight it at this point. But this is the reason, this above all other reasons, we have a technocratic elite that essentially controls the data in our country. There are people who have called for the International Monetary Fund. I saw this on Twitter. It was posted by Shoeonhead. Apparently, the International Monetary Fund suggests that we should have a credit system based on our search history. Now, of course, it's Shoeonhead, so several of her followers stated that this is the result of capitalism, except China's already doing it, and they're not capitalist. This has nothing to do with where the means of production come from. What it does have to do with are giving power to places that don't necessarily need to have that power. Okay? And the IMF is all for things like social credit systems. If you think the IMF is a benign actor, you're drinking something. They're just as corrupt as a lot of the bigger organizations are. Now, again, corruption doesn't necessarily mean it's nefarious. And I know a lot of people are going to scratch their heads at that. No. Corruption's a tool in politics. Corruption is a tool. Corruption is, I need to be able to make a trade deal with, let's say I'm the State Department, right? I work in the State Department. And my orders are to form a trade deal with China. And so I'm trying to negotiate this trade deal with China. But there's no benefit to them. Well, I could have a family member set up a deal with a business person in China to form a company of mutual benefit. And the person that my family member sets up that trade deal with happens to be a family member of the person who I need to negotiate with. See how that works? Now, in exchange for giving my family member that opportunity, my campaign fund gets a kickback via a PAC of some sort. And I'm sure you can guess where I got that particular line of reasoning from, but I wasn't necessarily trying to assert that's because anyone who's been watching the news knows that there are certain accusations that have been levied against a member of the Biden family, 2 members of the Biden family. And I'm not delving into that, but it's that story that made me use that example. You know, in my opinion, let's see the evidence. Let it be handled in court. If he's innocent, great. If he's guilty, fine. That's the way it works. That's the criminal justice system. However, because that's an in the news example, it was a really easy allegory to make. That's how corruption works, though. Corruption is a tool to get things done in politics. Is it good? No. Unfortunately, that's how things have worked since the beginning of time. And we've done a lot here in the United States to help try to root out corruption. Unfortunately, it's endemic. And where you have corruption, you lead toward dystopia. or you lead toward a much older style of government like feudalism. And it's entirely possible that we are starting to move toward a sort of neo-feudalist society where you have big aristocratic families that control the wealth. And there is a social strata that's impossible to break into for the most part. And in order to break into it, you have to toe the line or be sponsored. You have to have a patron. This is how Hollywood works. You know, you've got, to break into Hollywood, you have to find someone who's basically willing to patron you. It doesn't work exactly in that way. You don't have to have like a direct sponsor or anything like that. But you have to be able to schmooze the right people to get someone to kind of like you and take you under their wing and kind of lead you through it. From what I understand, that's essentially how it works. And the reason that Hollywood thinks the way it does is because Hollywood is pretty much a feast or famine thing. You land a gig, it's 30 grand. You know? So you can go from being dirt poor to being handed a check for $30,000 overnight if you've got the skills, talents, and connections. I only learned this today. And I learned it from a book by Ben Shapiro, who grew up in Hollywood. And you can like or dislike Ben Shapiro. There are things that he says I like, and there are definitely things he says I disagree with. Some quite vehemently. But getting that insight into Hollywood from someone who grew up there really made an impact to me and actually helped me to tailor the end of this particular podcast. Because this is where we're heading. You've got an elite atop everything. Our politicians have been in office essentially for half a century for a lot of them. Why is it no one... The Senate. The Senate itself is comprised of pretty much the same people that were there when I was a child. Eventually people retire. I had not even heard that Harry Reid retired, and he's been retired for a while. Of course, I knew he wasn't the Senate Majority Leader anymore, so I figured that he was gone, but they keep getting voted back in. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. If they're good governance, great. But it helps to stratify that elite status. People in my own state. The Senate in my state, when I looked at the ballot before I left, the last election I voted in Vermont, back in 2000, I want to say it was 2008. Yes, because I left before the 2010 midterms. And I looked at the ballot, and I saw the names. And I left for 8 years. And I came back in 2017. And in 2018, midterm elections, I had the ability to vote in Vermont again. Now, Vermont legislature, all of Vermont offices are voted on every 2 years. We don't have like a 4-year or 6. We're working on that, but we don't do that. All the names were the same. So what you see on the macro scale, you'll also find often on the micro scale, the state. You have major companies that form the technocracy. You have Hollywood, which forms its own nobility. And you have certain old money circles, and they're the aristocracy. And what's there for the rest of us? Well, before COVID, we had a fairly robust middle class. And I think we'll get it back, assuming nothing else goes completely haywire. Knock on wood. But it does really show the disparity between the aristocracy and everybody else. And I'm not saying that we need to destroy the aristocracy or eat the rich or any bullshit like that. But we need to admit it. That's something that in the United States especially we have trouble admitting. One of the things is, in the U.S., there is a constitutional law that states that the government cannot give out noble titles. And then it created senator and representative, which ended up becoming noble titles. But they're not supposed to be noble titles. They're supposed to be offices. In the U.S., we don't give out noble titles. That doesn't mean we don't have nobility. That doesn't mean we don't have an aristocracy. The aristocracy are the people in government, the people at Google and Facebook and Twitter, Amazon, Microsoft, and Hollywood. Because they control the realm of ideas. Now, again, I'm not railing against them. At least not yet. Some of them have said some pretty stupid shit in the past, but I'll let it go. But what we need to do as people, as this burgeoning subculture that understands, you know, in the Matrix they call that you take the red pill, and being red pilled has a whole new connotation in parlance now, but whoops, for the sake of this example, from the Matrix version of it, okay, as we start to see and accept that this is reality, that we do have this dystopia that's been built up around us, that we don't have the control we thought we did. That doesn't mean that we cause problems. We don't necessarily aim to misbehave. But what we need to aim to do is be self-aware. See, worlds like this have their own rules. They're laid out in things like Shadowrun. The rules that you follow, the rules you can avoid. And what we can do about it by understanding what's going on. You need to be high information. That information's going to, sometimes it's going to stress you out and sometimes it's going to piss you off. It's just the way it is. But what you can do is you can do the research. Look into it. Bother to look into things. And don't live in an echo chamber. Listen to people you disagree with. I listen to people I disagree with all the time. I'm friends with people I disagree with. And that's a good thing. You know? I've watched everything from the Young Turks to the Blaze. And the only time I dump a station that I pay attention to is when they start saying the same thing over and over and over and over again, unless it's newsworthy, right? If they're running a news story and there's updates, that's media. That's the way it's supposed to work. But if all I hear is the same tripe out of their mouth, that's when I stop paying attention to them. Like there was one particular company, one media company brand, and I watched them a lot. I'm not going to name them because I'm not going to call them out, but I watched them a lot. But after about 8 to 9 months, I started to predict what they were going to say. It's like, oh, they're talking about this. This is what they're going to say. And then they would say it. Maybe not the way I thought they would say it, but they'd still say it. So, of course, once you can predict what they're going to say, you can probably move on. But find find media companies you disagree with, people you disagree with, and talk to them. Find out their side of things so you can understand. Research things so you understand all the aspects behind it. Do your own fact checks. And don't rely on the fact checkers that a lot of these other companies rely upon, because they have their biases too, left, right, or center. Obviously, a fact checker for the Young Turks is going to have a different opinion than a fact checker from the Daily Wire, because they're dynamically opposed on the political spectrum. Check your own facts. Do the research. Roll it around in your head a little bit and come up with an informed opinion. This is how we counter the cyberpunk dystopia that has been built up around us. This is how we counter the information monopoly that these companies have. Is we do the research and then be your own advocate. Advocate for yourself when shit goes wrong. Advocate for your friends. Be willing to take a stand and be willing to back it up. And that doesn't mean you have to go out and cause mayhem. Quite the opposite. Please don't do that, because that only reduces the integrity of what the point you're trying to make, and it gives the authorities the excuse to put it down. But push back. Even in little ways. That's what this whole podcast is about. I'm pushing back against what I have seen as a growing, again, not nefarious, but it's a growing centralization of power around small groups of people, relatively small groups of people, small segments of people. There we go. Small segments of people. Now, what can we do about it? Right now, I don't know. I'm just beginning down this road in the darkness. One thing you can do is, of course, you can run for office. And I encourage everyone to consider running for office, because then you're putting your money where your mouth is. You can talk to people. You can do research. You can start a podcast. Become part of media. You can talk to your legislators. Engage with people. Engage with those in positions of power. A lot of them will talk to you if you engage them correctly. Write a letter. Ask them a question. Don't ask for help, but ask them a question like, what was your happiest moment in life? Build a relationship. Understand them so you can better understand the world that's being built around us. As time goes on, technology is going to become even more prolific in our lives. I mentioned in the last episode that I'm wholly expecting cybernetics to be part of my lifetime. Well, they already are. We've got certain implants, but to a much broader extent. I'm expecting the first stereotypical cyborg to exist in my lifetime. Full bionics. Maybe not to the extent of like the Borg in Star Trek, but where like Detmer in Discovery, for those Star Trek Discovery, for those of you who watch it, where she has a cybernetic implant around her head and a replaced eye from an injury. I think eventually we're going to go full Ghost in the Shell. Full body replacement, why not? Upload our brains into a computer. Like Diva from Escape from Paradise. That's all coming. I don't think we can stop it. I don't think we should. The more of that comes, the more likely we were gonna end up with a technocratic aristocracy to begin with, or technocracy to begin with. I guess that would be the correct term, is technocracy. There's one more thing that you need to remember about the technocracy. They're essentially immune to arrest. They're not absolutely immune to arrest, but think about it. When you control that much power, if they say the police are coming after you, what do? Well, Google's a great example. Google's might be the largest company in America, if not the world. They could just purchase private security companies. They could walk up to the owner of a private security company, hand them a bag of cash, and say, we own your company now, go guard our buildings. And some of these private security companies don't care. If you hire them or you purchase them, they'll fight cops. They'll absolutely fight cops. They don't care. And so now Google would have an army. They don't have one now. This is an example. Then Google would have an army. What do you do then? Not much you can do. It's kind of like in an episode of The Closer. The LAPD and the FBI got into a tizzy over a prisoner. And the FBI tried to exert federal jurisdiction over it. And the LAPD wasn't having anything of it. He's like, no, this is our prisoner and we're going to prosecute. The FBI agent came back and said, you don't have the authority to say that. And he goes, well, he's in my building. He's in my cell in my building, surrounded by 350 of my armed police officers. How much more authority do I need? Okay, so let's say cops try to serve a warrant, and you've got a company like Google, and let's say for the sake of this example, they do purchase like a private military company. And the FBI walks in and says, you're going to give us this data. Google could say, no, come take it. What then? Now, this is all speculative, of course. And again, I say this I keep hedging my words specifically so, one, I can minimize the amount of out of context clips that could come out of this, because I don't want someone to think that I sound like Alex fucking Jones. Two, Although, he can be entertaining. 2, I don't need Google's lawyers coming after me, and I don't want this video taken down. For all of the things that I have said today, the benefit that Google and YouTube and to a lesser extent Facebook and Twitter have provided humanity is incalculable. It's immense. They have done an enormous amount of good. And so I want you to know that for the time being, and oh, full disclosure, I should have said this at the beginning. Full disclosure, I was once a Google expert at Best Buy, which means Google used to pay my paycheck. I got paid to sell Google wares. So I'm to a certain extent, I'm very familiar with the Google ecosystem, which is why I say this from a position of experience. I really need to remember to put stuff like that at the beginning of the podcast, but that's okay. I think for the most part, for all of the potential harm that Google can do, they have done so much good. There would have to be a lot of harm done before it would counterbalance all the good that they have brought to us. That doesn't mean I'm not concerned, and that doesn't mean I don't think you should be concerned too. Concern does not equal fear. Concern does not equal anger, and concern does not mean I think they should be broken up. Concern does mean that I do want to keep an eye on them. And I think they should have an eye kept on them to keep them honest. So, I want to thank you all for joining me. I hope that this talk about Google has been thought-provoking. Because as time goes on and as things change, as we determine what our future is going to bring, as we navigate this cyberpunk dystopia that I keep talking about, we're going to see more and more of this. And we need to understand the capabilities before some action does happen. Because there have been times in history where people are like, I didn't even know this could happen. And then people are like, well, if you added 2 plus 2, you'd see it can make 4 a lot. And again, I'm not saying Google will do these things. I'm saying they're capable of it. And as long as we're self-aware that they're capable of it and understand that, we can keep an eye on things so they don't happen. And we'll keep moving forward. Shining a light through the darkness, we're navigating the cyberpunk dystopia. This is the Julien McBain Show.